It was a crisp autumn morning in Washington, D.C., the kind that carried a reverent stillness as dignitaries from around the world gathered at the Capitol steps. Flags fluttered gently in the breeze, cameras flashed, and anticipation hung in the air like a held breath. The Pope's visit to the United States was more than symbolic, it was historic. Pope Leo XIV, a figure as enigmatic as he was revered, had arrived for what many believed would be a gesture of unity in a time of global uncertainty. Vice President Kamala Harris stood among the invited leaders, her expression calm but watchful. She had prepared for this moment carefully, representing the US government at the highest level. She knew the cameras would be watching, and so would the world. As Pope Leo XIV emerged from his armored vehicle, the crowd erupted into respectful silence. Wearing white vestments that glowed under the morning sun, he moved slowly but deliberately, stopping to acknowledge some leaders with brief handshakes and nods. A hush fell as he approached the vice president, and then he walked past her. No handshake, no eye contact, no greeting. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but its weight was immediate and seismic. Kamala Harris, ever composed, maintained her posture, but something subtle shifted in her expression. She turned her eyes away, not in anger, but in confusion. The crowd did not react. The silence persisted. But within minutes, social media was ablaze. News outlets interrupted their regular programming. The clip replayed endlessly, dissected from every angle. Why had the Pope ignored the Vice President of the United States? Was it a mistake, a symbolic gesture, or something deeper? Before we uncover the truth behind the Pope's shocking gesture, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real stories that reveal the unexpected. In the hours following the event, the Vatican made no immediate comment. The White House issued a polite, vague statement thanking Pope Leo for his visit and reaffirming US-Vatican relations. But the silence from the Holy See only fueled speculation. Some pundits called it a breach of diplomacy. Others speculated about health, protocol confusion, or even a momentary lapse. But those who knew Pope Leo XIV best said this: nothing he did was without meaning. Born in the outskirts of Naples, Pope Leo had risen through the ranks of the Church with a reputation for unflinching conviction and deep moral contemplation. He was known to meditate for hours before any major speech. His papacy had been marked by subtle yet powerful gestures, visiting war-torn areas without press, washing the feet of refugees, speaking out against both populism and secular indifference. This was not a man who acted on impulse. As the diplomatic reception concluded, the Pope returned to his private quarters in the Apostolic Nunciature. Kamala Harris returned to her duties silent about the moment, yet behind closed doors her staff scrambled. They needed answers. Every government agency from the State Department to National Intelligence was buzzing, trying to understand what had just unfolded. What no one knew yet, what the world would only begin to discover in the days ahead, was that the Pope's gesture had been deliberate. Not out of anger or disdain, but out of a profound and deeply spiritual conviction. Something had led him to this decision, something far older than politics, something ancient, buried in theology, memory, and conscience. And the truth, when revealed, would shake the foundations of both faith and power. Long before the silence in Washington echoed through headlines, Pope Leo XIV had been preparing for this moment in ways few could imagine. Behind the ornate walls of the Vatican, whispers of concern had grown into quiet warnings. Spiritual advisors, moral theologians, and even the Pope's most trusted aides had begun to sense an unease in him, something contemplative, even burdened. Leo XIV was not an ordinary pontiff. Born as Lorenzo Vitale, his early life was steeped in hardship. Raised in the industrial outskirts of Naples, he had seen the underside of society long before he donned the robes of spiritual authority. His priesthood was forged not in luxury but in service to the poor, the broken, the forgotten. His sermons were laced with poetry and fire, always rooted in truth, often unsettling to those in power. When he was elected to the papacy, many were surprised. He was not a career cardinal. He had declined appointments, avoided political entanglements, and spent much of his time in silent retreat. But his vision was clear: restore the Church's moral clarity, even if it meant shaking the status quo. In recent years, the Pope had grown increasingly contemplative about the role of leadership in the modern world. He saw the lines between power and virtue blur too often. Leaders spoke of justice while enabling injustice. They preached peace, but profited from conflict. And for Leo, the Church's role was not to be a partner in diplomacy, but a mirror to conscience. Just months before his visit to the United States, Pope Leo convened a private council of advisors. The topic: the integrity of moral witness in global governance. The discussions were intense. Several nations were mentioned, policies analyzed, but one theme emerged again and again: the crisis of spiritual silence in the face of ethical contradictions. A few weeks before his departure, Leo retreated to the monastery of San Benedetto in Subiaco, a place of profound stillness. There he fasted, prayed, and read the writings of St. Augustine and Catherine of Siena. He carried with him a medallion engraved with a single word in Latin: veritas, truth. The Pope's closest aide, Cardinal Simeone Ratti, later confided to a fellow bishop that Leo had spoken of a moment of necessary silence. He did not elaborate, but there was gravity in his tone, the kind that preceded decision rather than reflection. On the flight to Washington, Leo sat in silence for most of the journey. He declined the usual briefings, ignored the press packets, and held a small leather-bound journal. Occasionally he would write, then close it again. When the Vatican motorcade arrived in the city, the Pope paused before stepping out. He removed the medallion from around his neck and placed it in the pocket of his cassock. His eyes, Cardinal Ratti later said, were calm, clearer than they had been in years. From the moment his feet touched American soil, Pope Leo was not simply fulfilling a diplomatic duty. He was on a pilgrimage of conscience. Every interaction, every word, every silence carried meaning. And so when he walked past Vice President Kamala Harris without a greeting, it was not an accident, nor a diplomatic oversight. It was the culmination of months, perhaps years, of spiritual discernment, not yet understood, not yet explained, but deeply intentional. The world, watching from afar, remained unaware of what had been stirring behind the Vatican's gates. But something had indeed been stirring, a moral storm wrapped not in thunder but in quiet. Kamala Harris had never been a stranger to scrutiny. Her journey through the labyrinth of American politics had been one marked by triumphs, trials, and a relentless climb through an unforgiving system. From the district attorney's office in San Francisco to the vice presidency, her name had become synonymous with ambition and resilience. But along that ascent, she had made choices, some widely praised, others quietly condemned. Years before her rise to national prominence, during her tenure as California's Attorney General, Kamala received a confidential letter. It bore the seal of the Vatican and came from a little-known archbishop stationed in the United States. The content was measured but clear. It expressed concern about proposed legislation involving bioethics, human dignity, and the Church's moral stance. It was not a threat. It was a plea. Kamala never responded. At the time, her office was flooded with communications. Lobbyists, activists, religious leaders, everyone had an opinion. The Vatican's letter was just one among thousands, but for the Holy See, the silence was significant. To them, it wasn't merely a missed response. It was symbolic of something deeper, a growing divide between power and reverence. As years passed, the rift widened. Kamala's policies on reproductive rights and criminal justice drew increasing criticism from religious organizations, not for their legality, but for their moral implications. While she maintained a public persona of open dialogue, insiders knew she kept her distance from institutions she viewed as politically encumbering, including the Church. Behind closed doors, her advisors often debated how to navigate Vatican relations. Some suggested stronger engagement, others advised minimal contact. Kamala chose silence, preferring to focus on domestic matters. She believed governance should be free from religious pressure. But Pope Leo XIV saw things differently. To him, silence in the face of moral appeals wasn't neutrality, it was rejection. He had studied Kamala's public record, her interviews, her decisions. What disturbed him most wasn't her ideology, but what he perceived as an erosion of conscience beneath the surface of modern leadership. In the days following the Washington incident, as global media scrambled for insight, a Vatican scholar anonymously released a document from the archives. It referenced the old letter sent to Kamala years prior. Though it did not accuse, it raised questions. Why had she ignored the Vatican's concern? Had dialogue ever truly been possible? The release was quickly picked up by news outlets, sparking heated debate. Defenders of Kamala called it a breach of protocol, a politicized move by a religious institution. Critics saw it as vindication, a quiet revelation of long-standing tension. In the White House, Kamala was furious, not publicly, but privately. She demanded a report. Why had this come out now? Who leaked the archive? But beneath the surface of anger was something else. Discomfort. Not guilt, but a stirring unease. She remembered the letter. She remembered choosing not to reply. And now that choice had returned, magnified by time and circumstance. The silence from the Vatican after Leo's gesture had become louder than words. Analysts began to frame it as a message not just to Kamala, but to all leaders who had dismissed spiritual voices. The Pope had made no speech. He had issued no condemnation. Yet the absence of a greeting had become the loudest rebuke. In her private quarters, Kamala reread old briefings from her Attorney General years. One file in particular had a sticky note in her handwriting. Revisit. Too controversial. The file was marked Vatican Correspondence. She closed the folder, but the memory stayed. Something had changed. Not yet visibly, not yet spoken, but a door had opened inside her that she thought had long been sealed. 3 days after the silent incident in Washington, the Vatican issued a press advisory. No details, no elaboration, just a line. His Holiness will address the press from St. Peter's Basilica. The world held its breath. No pope had ever made a public statement in response to a diplomatic gesture or a mission. Cameras were readied. Journalists flew in from 5 continents. The tension was biblical. When Pope Leo XIV finally emerged, his appearance was strikingly unceremonious. No entourage, no fanfare, just a simple white cassock and the same solemn gaze that had accompanied him past Kamala Harris days earlier. He stepped to the pulpit, rested his hands on its edge, and opened a worn Bible. He did not mention her name. He did not need to. He began with a passage from the book of Isaiah. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. His voice was steady, not harsh, but deliberate. He spoke of truth, not as an abstract principle, but as a living force that demanded witness, even when that witness required discomfort. He paused often, allowing silence to stretch across the square. He spoke of leadership, the weight of decisions, and the moral burden that came with authority. To govern is to serve, and to serve is to protect what is sacred, he said. When power separates itself from conscience, we do not lose politics, we lose humanity. Then he turned his message toward the modern era, mentioning a crisis of conscience in governments that proclaim virtue but legislate against it. The crowd remained frozen, his tone never wavered. Still no names, still no direct accusations, but there was no doubt whom he was addressing. He spoke of a world where dignity was redefined for convenience, where truth was blurred by consensus, and where silence, strategic, political silence, was often more harmful than speech. A gesture, he said, can be more powerful than a sermon, and silence, when deliberate, can awaken what words cannot. When he finished, the square erupted in questions. The Pope offered none. He turned, walked away, and left the world to interpret. The reaction was instantaneous. Some called him arrogant, accusing the Vatican of meddling in democratic affairs. Others hailed him as courageous, a lone voice refusing to bow to pressure. Religious leaders released statements of support. Editorials flooded newspapers. Commentators drew parallels to John Paul II's silent resistance to tyranny. Leo XIV had entered a new category, not just spiritual leader, but moral lightning rod. In Washington, Kamala Harris watched the address in private. According to an aide, She sat motionless for most of it, her hands folded in her lap. When it ended, she simply said, "I understand." That same day, she released a short statement. "I acknowledge the concerns raised by Pope Leo XIV. Though we come from different callings, we share a duty to the people we serve. I respect his voice and I hear it." It was measured, diplomatic, and yet subtly personal. She did not dispute his words, nor did she defend herself. Within the Vatican, the decision to speak had not come lightly. Days earlier, Leo had wrestled with the idea of remaining silent forever. But after days of prayer, he told Cardinal Ratti, "If I do not speak now, I become complicit in every silence that follows." Privately, those close to the Pope revealed he had not slept the night before. He had written and rewritten the speech 3 times. He knew the cost of such a gesture, but he also knew the cost of remaining still. In the weeks that followed, the world continued to reverberate from the silent gesture and the words that came after. Op-eds, sermons, and think pieces flooded the public sphere. Pope Leo XIV had not just walked past a political figure, he had awakened a dormant conversation about conscience, leadership, and the role of morality in modern governance. Some political commentators declared the moment a turning point in global diplomacy, when symbolism overtook protocol and forced a deeper reckoning. Others feared it set a dangerous precedent where religion might again insert itself into state affairs. But amidst the noise, something quieter began to emerge: reflection. Kamala Harris, long known for her sharp rhetoric and unwavering poise, made fewer public appearances. According to sources close to her, she began scheduling private meetings with religious leaders from various faiths, not for press, not for policy, but for perspective. She was seen visiting a small chapel in Washington during early morning hours, alone, without escort. There she sat in silence, just as Leo XIV had done days before the visit. It wasn't a conversion nor a public show, it was personal, and though no statement followed, those near her said she carried herself differently, less guarded, more attuned. At a fundraiser weeks later, she was asked directly about her views on the intersection of faith and policy. Her answer surprised many. "I've spent years believing that silence was a form of strength, but lately I've learned that silence, when it avoids hard truths, can become a kind of absence. Leadership requires not just strategy, but soul." Her words echoed far beyond the ballroom. At the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV returned to his quiet routines. He issued no follow-up, he gave no interviews. When asked by a journalist in passing whether he regretted the gesture, he smiled and said only, "The truth does not need repetition." Yet the consequences of his choice continued to ripple. Across the world, debates about ethical leadership re-emerged in parliaments and presidential palaces. Religious leaders felt emboldened to speak on matters they had once feared touching. And citizens, those long disillusioned by performative politics, began to ask deeper questions about the values that guided their elected officials. Leo XIV, for all his humility, had reignited a global conversation, not through protest or decree, but through restraint, through a single act of intentional omission. Historians will debate whether the Pope's silence was confrontation or counsel, whether it divided or healed. But in the hearts of millions, the moment planted something no headline could fully capture: the possibility that even the smallest gesture, rooted in integrity, could challenge the foundations of power. And as for Kamala Harris, her path remained complex. She continued to lead, to legislate, to face opposition. But something had shifted. She no longer dismissed faith as a peripheral matter. It had become part of her lens, her questioning, not because of doctrine, but because of conscience. She never spoke publicly about the moment the Pope walked past her, but those closest to her say that in private, she once described it not as a slight, but as an invitation to listen, to reconsider, to change. If this story moved you, subscribe now and click on the suggested video on your screen to explore another story that challenges what we think we know.